Okay, let's continue, please, looking at the 7 seals. We're up to the 6th seal. The 6th seal in Revelation. And we'll read it. Verse 12, and I looked, and when he broke the 6th seal, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth made of hair, and the whole moon became like blood. And the stars of the sky fell to earth as a fig tree casts its unripe figs when shaken by a great wind. And the sky was split asunder like a scroll when it is rolled up, and every mountain and island were moved out of their place. And the kings of the earth, and the great men, and the commanders, and the rich and strong, and every slave and free man, hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains, fallout shelters. And they said to the mountains and the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the presence of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who is able to stand? Now is the sign in the sky. Okay. This one is utter terror. Not terrorism, terror. The party is over and they know it. Is the rapture a secret? Yes, because we don't know when it is going to happen. When it happens, will it still be a secret? What happened to these guys? No, they will know what happened to these guys. The rapture is only a secret in the sense we don't know when it is. Once it happens, it's not like this Tim LaHaye stuff. Business as usual, they think they can go on. It's not going to be like that. God is angry. He's angry because of what they did to his people, the church, and he's angry because of what they're trying to do to his people, Israel. At this point, the Antichrist goes absolutely mad. He already knows his time is short, but somehow he imagines he can win. Now he is desperate. Now he is in a frantic state. He must now try to eliminate Israel. We'll talk about this in our next session later. What happens when the man-child is removed and he goes after the woman. Chapter 12, but that's later. Okay. This becomes sheer terror. These things all have more than one meaning. There is, as always, the Peshet and the Pesher. Abraham's descendants are like the stars of heaven. This articulates with chapter 12, when the dragon sweeps a third of the stars from heaven, right? In some contexts, stars are spirits, angelic, but here they are not. 1/3 of the angels followed Satan, it would appear. The great falling away, the great apostasy, will reach its climax in one last fell swoop. When push comes to shove, when the Antichrist here is in full power, when the power of the holy people has been shattered, there will be a massive, massive falling of stars. At this time, the sun will not give its light. What does this mean? The falling away. The Bible uses sunrise as a metaphor for the resurrection, doesn't it? All 4 Gospels say he rose at sunrise. Isaiah, arise and shine, for your light has come. The glory of the risen Lord is brighter than the sun. He raises at sunrise. The moon has no light of its own. The moon simply reflects the light of the sun. The light of Jesus will not be seen on the earth at all. The church will no longer reflect it. Now, am I saying blood on the moon doesn't mean that there was blood is life and astronauts went to the moon? I'm not saying it doesn't have that's not prophetically important. There has been literally blood on the moon. In the Middle East, you get a phenomenon at certain times of year where the moon does look a deep orangey red. I've seen it. Maybe you've seen it. We're not negating literal things. The sun became black as sackcloth, made of hair, and the whole moon became like blood, and the stars fell from the sky. I'm simply saying the cosmic phenomena reflects spiritual things. What happens physically is a reflection of what is happening spiritually. For instance, those days had been cut short. Remember Kolobo? Look with me, please, to chapter 16. These become the bowl judgments. When these days are cut short, incredible things begin to happen very, very quickly. A wholesale destruction of the environment as we know it. This is the time of God's wrath, and these nations at this point begin to assemble in the Valley of Armageddon in verse 16 to try to get rid of Israel. Satan failed to get rid of the church, but now he's going to try to get rid of Israel. This is what we see in chapter 12, and it's what we see in chapter 16, verse 16. Okay. Now something else happens. There are 3 times in the Bible where God interferes with time at least. Okay? When Joshua holds the sun still. When Jesus was crucified, fulfilling the prophecy of Amos 8. It was dark at noon. Couldn't have been an eclipse because it was Passover. Opposite phase of the lunar cycle. 3rd time is when the day goes from 24 to 16 hours in Revelation. That cutting short of the day, a physical event, is emblematic of what is happening spiritually, of the amputation. Okay? Time is cut short. But the skies are rolled up like a scroll. Remember, Kairos and Chronos. In eternity, there is no Kairos. All time depends on planetary motion. This idea of the Uranus in Greek, of the Shemaim in Hebrew, being rolled up like a scroll, what does that mean? Eternity comes into meeting with earth. Paul went to the 3rd heaven, remember? The Greeks, well, different myths, but some of them had up to 7 heavens. But there are 3 in the New Testament, 3 heavens. The first is the atmosphere of the earth. That's the 1st heaven, our sky. The 2nd heaven is outer space, where the planets and so forth and other galaxies and solar systems are. That's the 2nd heaven. The 3rd heaven is eternity. Okay? The 2nd heaven is the basis for time. And it is the divide between eternity and being temporal, between the temporal realm of existence and the eternal one. Whether or not black holes in space with the event horizon or windows into eternity, I don't know. It's a good question. I'm not saying it is. I'm simply saying it's an interesting question. There is obviously more matter in our universe that we can account for, and even light particles can't escape from the black holes. Whether these things are some kind of windows, I have no idea. But I do know this, that the 2nd heaven is the barrier between the eternal and the temporal, between the 3rd heaven, eternity, and this earth, this world. It's a haunt of demons. The cosmos needs to be cleansed. Powers of the air. But it gets rolled up. Time ceases to exist once the sky is rolled up because you have no basis for time anymore. There is no planetary motion when that happens. It is if, when it is rolled up, why is it rolled up? Because something is going to go through it. Us. You understand? The divide is rolled up so we can cross it. When somebody goes to be with the Lord simply by biological expiration, their spirit goes. The spirit can cross the divide and enter eternity. Flesh and blood cannot enter the kingdom as such. Yet Jesus was bodily resurrected. Elijah was bodily resurrected. Okay? Enoch was bodily resurrected. Our spirit can cross it, but it's not just our spirit that's going to cross it. When you give up the ghost, you go to be with the Lord, that's it. Your body is here asleep on the ground, but you are in the conscious presence of the Lord. That is not what we're talking about. We shall be changed. It opens up. Our bodies go. There'll be no corporal remains left here. There will be no corporal remains of any Christian, dead or alive. Even the dead ones aren't going to be here. Even their bones, the matter that they were composed of, they'll come back together and they'll be taken out of here. There has to be this rolling up. This has to do much with the fig tree. Whenever you see the fig tree, anything to do with the fig tree, think of the last days, the parable of the fig tree and the other trees. We talked about this on the Future History of the Church tape and on the Antichrist tape. Okay? When this happens, people go mad. Head for the basement, head for the caves, head for the fallout shelters. But it won't work. Because the powers of the earth will be shaken. Remember, these physical events have a spiritual meaning, every one of them. Okay? Every slave and free man. We don't think of slavery. But what God calls slavery still exists. Chad has slavery. Mauritania has slavery. Sudan has slavery. Niger has slavery. Each one of them, it's rich Muslims with poor blacks who are their slaves. Literal slavery. But then you have other kinds of slavery in the world, like when Saudi sheiks go to India and they buy little girls for $200 from their family and call it an employment contract. It's slavery. But there's another kind of slavery. It is called APR. God did not allow usury because he knew it would lead to slavery. God did not allow for the permanent expropriation of property from families as delineated by Joshua. In the year of Jubilee, it had to be restored. God would not allow these things for his people. In the millennium, we will not have these things. Okay? But you bring about slavery by economic means, as it happened in the book of Amos. They may not call it slavery, but the fact is somebody else owns your land if you have a mortgage. The fact is you're working for somebody else if you are paying a high APR. If you are trying to balance your future on credit, you're working for somebody else. There is a credit balloon globally. We're talking now of trillions and trillions of dollars. Now, much of this is private debt. A fair amount is corporate debt, and a huge amount is government debt. But where does governments get the money to service the interest on their debt? From their people. Now, we don't think of it in the Western world yet. You remember Ceausescu in Romania? You had to have 5 children because he needed this much of a workforce to increase GNP to pay his debt. He lived salubriously. The people were virtual slaves, kept in line by the Securitata. It was slavery. The Iron Curtain was slavery. This becomes global. Now, how did this kind of slavery come about? It came about through people talking about social enterprises. It came about through people talking about Marxist principles. What is the first principle of Marxism? Man is God. The proletariat should control the economy. The proletariat should control the government. Wonderful principles, but what you wind up with is something worse than capitalism. What they wound up with was a party elite who enslaved the people. As far as the Soviets were concerned, those people were simply their serfs, their slaves. To the point where Ceausescu would basically breed human beings. He would literally breed them for an economic motive. We have to understand what the Bible means by slavery. Yes, literal slavery exists in the Islamic world, and with the growth of Islam, it's increasing. Why did slavery end in Britain and America? Wesley, Wilberforce, Shaftesbury, because of the gospel. You take the gospel away, you're going to have slavery again. Already in London, they had housemaids from the Philippines working for Saudi Arabian executives and diplomats. These women were being beaten, starved, flogged. What? You forgot to dust the bookshelf? And they would just beat them. These women's visas to live in Britain were dependent upon their employer. Sorry, you can go back to the rubbish heaps of Manila, or you can stay here and do what we do. Money talks. Money talks. This goes on in America. Islam is a slave religion. You are letting in a religion that breeds slavery. Islam is only one aspect. If you look at the debt explosion, if you look at third world debt, the IMF has to put conditions on third world countries. The World Bank must put conditions on third world countries to service the interest on their existing debt. Otherwise, you'd have a banking crisis in Europe, America, and Japan. If these countries all defaulted at the same time, you'd have a crisis here. They would drag the developed world down with them. So they've redefined insolvency. They've redefined bankruptcy as not simply a default on principle. Now the World Bank and the IMF has had to redefine insolvency as inability to service the interest on the principal. In other words, it's not your inability to pay back the loan, it's your inability to pay the interest on the loan. Hence, you have a third world where people have slave conditions. You can't raise wages. You must work for this because we have to make these commitments to the IMF to keep ourselves solvent. Well, they want third world debt relief. In Africa. Africa has received nearly $1 trillion in international aid since the 1960s. More than any other continent. The fact that most of it was misappropriated, misallocated, and stolen is not the issue to them. Give us more. Now, anybody who's been to Africa understands it's futile to give debt relief to Africa because they'll just go back and get right back in the same mess unless you get rid of these despotic governments like Mugabe and the ANC in South Africa. You're throwing good money after bad. The only way to help Africans is for Christians to help the people directly, but to try to help these governments, it doesn't work. You're throwing good money after bad. So now you got a situation. They are enslaving their people to meet the conditions of the IMF and World Bank. If they don't, we have a banking crisis in the developed world. And you'll see what they did. What did Barclays do when it began getting in trouble with third world debt? Laying people off. Sorry, you used to wait in line 10 minutes for Barclays Bank. Now you wait in line 20 minutes. We have to lay off tellers. They increased their service charges for their own customers in England or anywhere else. They tried to get it from us, you understand? This creates an issue that is going to bring about something the book of Revelation calls slavery. Third world debt is a humongous issue. And as far as debt relief, forget it. You'll be throwing good money after bad because of these despotic governments. They will just steal it and mismanage it. Just take a look. Singapore, Malaysia, they became independent the same time as Ghana. Yet in Asia, you have economic growth. In Africa, major areas of Latin America, the Caribbean, you don't. What's the problem here? What's the problem? Well, the problem is, obviously, it's sin, it's corruption, it's false religion, idolatry. These things make problems. The closer a Muslim nation is to Mecca, the more injustice it's going to have. It's amazing. Even countries with a lot of oil and low populations, like Kuwait, you get two classes of people. You'd think with such a low population and all that money, there would be less poverty. Saudi Arabia, they don't like to talk about it, but all that money is in the hands of the House of Saud. There's poverty. You go away from Mecca towards Malaysia, what do you see? The further away they are from Mecca, the more affluence among the Muslims. Chinese business community makes Malaysia a prosperous country. False religion brings poverty. Now, the money preachers have corrupted this for their own purpose. But in the last days, in the book of Revelation, this whole thing that is already coming to a climax now, the issue of third world debt, the issue of first world debt, the issue of personal debt. It not only comes to a climax, it explodes, where you basically have an institutionalized practice of de facto slavery. It doesn't matter what they call it. People would say, Ceausescu didn't have slaves. God says, yes, he did. What's the difference? Talk to people who went to Romania and saw those orphanages after Ceausescu fell. There's no other word for it. It was slavery. There was no other word. What did Stalin do to the Ukrainians? There's no other word for it. It was slavery. Slavery. Slavery is going to come back big time. And I don't just mean to the third world. You're going to see an institutionalized slavery. All they'll do is call it something else. They'll call it something else. But it will still be based on things like race. It will still be based on things like class. Don't think when the book of Revelation talks about things like slavery, people will see that and say, well, this proves it couldn't be for modern times or have a future meaning. There's no slavery anymore. They don't know what they're talking about. They don't know what they are talking about. There is slavery. Most people are not economically independent. A free man is that. If somebody has more debt than they have assets, they're already becoming enslaved. So this issue explodes. The kings of the earth the great men and commanders, the rich and strong, and every slave and free man. Somebody's socioeconomic status, the nation of their citizenship, their position will no longer matter. Being an oligarch, being a baron, being a tycoon, being a senior executive, being a key professional, or being somebody who works in a petrol station, or being a slave in Mauritania. It doesn't matter anymore. It doesn't matter. You can't take it with you unless you give it to Jesus when you're alive. This sign introduces something. We have an entire chapter now dedicated solely to this. It is chapter 7, the interlude. When does the rapture and resurrection happen? When is the harpazo? When is the Anastasia? When is the episunagage? When is this event we're all looking for? Where does it take place? This is the penultimate event in human history. Up till now, rivaled only by the death and resurrection of Jesus since the creation, and will be eclipsed only by his coming with the saints. Can the penultimate event in human history be a secret the Bible doesn't talk about? We're all looking for the coming of the Lord, the harpazo, the episunagage, the parousia. We're all looking for this. Since the early church, they were saying Maranatha. The idea that some pre-tribulational people have, it's so secret it's not even in the Bible. That's virtually what it comes to. They say it's in, even guys like John MacArthur, it's in the blank spaces, he says. The rapture is in the blank space. It's such an important event, and it's not in there? It's an absurd statement. Now, don't get me wrong. I respect John MacArthur. He's taken stands on a lot of issues, like the ecumenical movement. I respect what he says. He believes the Word of God. He's not a bad man. I don't agree with him on some issues, but he's still a brother. But the idea that he and others like him have, that can anybody really think anything as crucial as the rapture would be left out? Right in the middle of the Olivet Discourse, right in the middle of Matthew 24, where he's talking about all this bad stuff, about the horsemen. He's talking about, he's talking about the wars, rumors of wars, famines, pestilence, earthquakes, natural disasters. And then he says, after all that stuff, then he says, but immediately after the tribulation, they're going to see the Son of Man coming, and he will send his angel with a great trumpet and gather his elect. How much more clear can you be? It's right dead in the middle of the Olivet Discourse. And it is right dead in the middle of the book of Revelation. It is chapter 7. Let's read it. After this, after the sixth seal, I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds of the earth, so that no wind should blow on the earth or on the sea or any tree. Remembering the Greek word there is also a word for spirit, pneuma, Hebrew ruach. And I saw another angel ascending from the rising of the sun, having the seal of the living God, and he cried out with a loud voice to the four angels to whom it was granted to harm the earth and the sea. Now we're talking about the fundamental destruction of the environment, but something's going to happen first. Do not harm the earth or the sea or the trees until we have sealed the bondservants of our God on their foreheads. Again, there's always a double meaning. You have the beast that came out of the earth, the beast that came out of the sea, Israel and the nations. Okay. The trees of the field will clap their hands, we shall be trees of righteousness. Before God lets this onslaught happen, he has to do something. He seals the 144,000. This comes straight from the book of Ezekiel. What happened before the Babylonian captivity is written in Jeremiah. What happened during it is written in Ezekiel and Daniel. Let's look at the book of Ezekiel, please. In Ezekiel 8 and 9, we did a tape on it called Greater Abominations. All of these abominations were happening in the temple. They were happening in God's house. And God kept telling, or Ezekiel was repeatedly told, yet greater abominations than these will you see, yet greater abominations than these you will see, yet greater abominations than these you will see. It kept getting worse and worse and worse. Did anyone hear the tape I did, Greater Abominations? Yeah, it just kept getting worse and worse and worse. It's the same in the church. Remember, the New Testament calls the church the temple 7 times. Ordaining homosexuals in the church, yet greater abominations than these you'll see. The church giving its approval to religions that worship demons, Hinduism, Islam, yet greater abominations than these you'll see. It just gets worse and worse and worse in God's house, in his Heron, in his Naos, in his temple. However, in chapter 9, verse 4, the Lord said to him, go through the midst of the city, even through the midst of Jerusalem, and put a mark on the foreheads of the men who sigh and groan over the abominations which are being committed in the midst. Now on the tape, greater abominations than these, I should really refilm it. I think we should have Darren film it if we can, ask him to. It was the letter Tav. The Hebrew letter Tav. But if you look at ancient manuscripts, in Qumran, you see that Tav was not always written like this. It was written like this in its most ancient form. Don't harm it yet until we seal those who mourn over it. Remember, God is not angry at his people. He's angry at the others. Those who see the state of the church, who see the ordination of homosexuals, who see the ecumenical movement, who see the purpose-driven, and they mourn, they grieve over these abominations. God is not angry at such people. They may be persecuted by the enemy, but they will not experience the wrath of God. He's not appointed us for wrath. Now this specifically, again, has something to do with the Jews, believing Jews. They are sealed. But now let's look. Notice there is no more seals in terms of the 7 seals until chapter 8. They end in chapter 6. Chapter 8, the final one resumes when the trumpets are unleashed. The trumpets have to do with the wrath of God. The final trumpet being blown is the one that corresponds to Yom Kippur in the year of Jubilee, when the walls of Jericho came down, and Joshua entering with the children of Israel into the promised land and taking over Jericho is a picture of Jesus coming back with his church, taking dominion. Remember? And then the land was delineated. They were given their inheritance. The meek shall inherit the earth. That's to do with the trumpets. The trumpets are after we're out of here. That resumes in chapter 8. The trumpets don't concern us as such, except for the last one, because we come back with Jesus. What we see in Zechariah 12. We're concerned with the seals. But we just had the last seal that concerns us, the sixth one. Verse 9, after these things, so there's a chronology. I looked, and behold, a great multitude which no one could count, from every nation and all tribes and peoples and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes, and palm branches were in their hands. Now notice these people are described the same way as the ones who were martyred, whose blood was crying out from the altar. And they cry out with a loud voice, saying, salvation to our God, who sits on the throne, and to the Lamb. And all the angels were standing around the throne and around the elders, and the four living creatures, and they fell on their faces before the throne and worshiped God, saying, Amen. Blessing and glory and wisdom and thanksgiving and honor and power and might be to our God forever and ever. Amen. And one of the elders answered, saying to me, these who are clothed in white robes, who are they, and where have they come from? And I said to him, my Lord, you know. And he said to me, these are the ones who have come out of the great tribulation, and have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. For this reason they are before the throne of God, and they serve him day and night in his temple. And he who sits on the throne shall spread his tabernacle over them. And they shall hunger no more, neither thirst any more, bearing in mind what was going on before in the tribulation. Neither shall the sun beat down on them, nor any heat. For again, the environmental catastrophes were affecting everyone. For the Lamb in the center of the throne shall be their shepherd, and shall guide them to the springs of the water of life. And God shall wipe every tear from their eyes. Every tear. On the Thanatology tapes we explain this. The thing that haunts most of us most is loved ones who died without knowing Jesus. The idea of us being in heaven and them being in hell. How can we deal with this? There is no annihilation. There is nothing in the Bible that supports annihilationism. But you can say that God can annihilate the memory of them. It will be to us as if they never existed. Unsaved loved ones who died, we will have no recollection of them as such. Not that they're annihilated, but any implications they have for us will simply not exist. There'll be no more suffering, no tears, nothing of any description that is in any way negative. This is clearly and plainly the coming of Jesus in the rapture for us. It's clearly our removal from this place before the wrath of God begins. Once we are taken out of here, chapter 8, verse 1, the seventh seal is broken. Then comes the trumpets. Judgment upon judgment upon judgment. From this time on, Satan is going after the Jews and trying desperately to prevent the return of Christ. What I'm saying is, up until chapter 8, the trumpet judgments, the seal judgments, the focus is on the church. After the church is removed, the focus switches. Okay? God now is looking to save Israel. The faithful church has been saved. This doctrine of the tribulation saints is greatly overstated. Greatly. If people can't be faithful now, you think they're going to be... Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If they're not going to be faithful now, when you can't buy or sell with them. I know of 2 preachers, one in America, one in South Africa, saying it's okay to take the mark of the beast. It doesn't matter anything. The book of Revelation has no future meaning. They're being taught this from the pulpit. They will believe it. I'm very concerned about this company, VeriChip. I wrote the president a letter. Not that it did any good. I'm sure other Christians wrote him a letter. But we can even see technologically what's possible. The point being this. The number of the beast and the seal of the Lamb are mutually exclusive. For the ones who are going to be here, you will either have the seal of the Lamb or you will have the mark of the beast. It looks like the two are mutually exclusive. The focus becomes largely on the Jews. The time of the Gentiles is over. This idea of great revivals in the Revelation and the 144,000, what am I saying? I'm saying this. The book of Revelation says, when these judgments multiply, men still did not repent of their wicked deeds. Do you know what happened last week? The first day when the floods in Louisiana and Mississippi began to recede. The first day when they were able to get large amounts of supplies in instead of small amounts. In Bourbon Street in New Orleans and in Lafayette, Louisiana, 2 different places, they had the Southern Decadence Festival. Gay pride parades in New Orleans and in Lafayette. People are going out now. Their homes are not there anymore. They're looking for the bodies of dead loved ones floating in the street. They're looking for the remains of missing loved ones. People are floating in the street dead. I watched them on the news. They found people just floating, just face down, floating dead. People are looking, is that my brother? Is that my mother? Is that my son? Is that my baby? People are looking for the dead bodies of loved ones. They're worried about an epidemic, a disease, a pestilence coming because of the environmental conditions after the hurricane. And these people are having a gay pride parade in the same location. Think of the days of Lot. They were struck blind. And even when they were struck blind, they were so driven by their perversion, they were trying to rape the angels. Crazy. That's what the last days will be like. This idea of the tribulation saints, it is greatly, greatly overstated. Once we get out of here, the redemptive focus of God becomes centrally concentrated on the redemption of Israel. The time of the Gentiles is over. Am I absolutely saying nobody else will be saved? I didn't say that, but I'm saying this idea of the tribulation saints is a big nonsense. It's amplified out of all proportion to anything the Bible actually says of the subject. A secret rapture. Of course it's secret in that we don't know when it's going to happen. How can you possibly say when Jesus says the angel comes to gather his elect, that's not the rapture and resurrection? How can anybody possibly say that chapter 7 is not clearly the gathering of the saints out of here? It's obvious. It's plain as day. Yet, we have people who'd rather believe something else. I did a tape once called Death of Reason. I'm wanting to do one that was for unsaved people. But now I want to do one for Christians called Reductio ad absurdum. It can't mean what it seems to believe, so we have to come up with some absurd way to explain as being or meaning something else. It's quite clear what happens in chapter 7. The trumpets end in chapter 6, resume in chapter 8. In chapter 7, the saints are taken out of here. God anoints the 144,000, and his focus becomes on the Jews, and the Antichrist begins to go mad.